The land was still broken and dry, the wind still carried grit and old ghosts, but as Jace McKenna pressed his hand against the bleeding wound on his arm, he wasn't thinking about the pain. He was thinking about the girl clinging to his back barefoot, breathless and shaking from a terror that hadn't yet let go of her spine. The same terror that had once lived in him long ago on a battlefield back east where he'd buried brothers and burned bridges. The arrow still stuck out of his trail coat, jutting from the flesh of his left arm like a cruel reminder. But he didn't pull it. Not yet. Not while they were still riding. They broke through the brush just as the sky turned the color of rust. Naomi's arms were tight around his middle, her breath hot against his back, each jolt of the horse a sharp stab to his wound. But he didn't stop until they reached the slope near his cabin, a place he'd spent the last 5 years pretending the world didn't exist. Jace dismounted with a grunt and nearly dropped to his knees. The dirt tasted like copper in his mouth. Naomi slid off behind him without a word, but when he looked back, she wasn't crying. She was scanning the ridge, barefoot, bleeding and hunted, but her eyes were sharp. Alive. He opened the door to the cabin without a word. She hesitated only a second before following him in. The inside was sparse, a table, a small iron stove, a rolled cot shelves with dried beans and tools. He hadn't built it for anyone but himself. Now he couldn't ignore the second set of footsteps echoing off the floorboards. His breath came hard and shallow as he yanked off his coat. Blood had soaked through to his shirt and the arrow had broken the skin clean. He braced himself on the edge of the table, eyes blurred from grit and pain. That's when Naomi moved quietly, efficiently toward the crate in the corner where he kept clean cloth and water. She didn't ask. Didn't need to. She knelt beside him and cut the sleeve away with his own knife, her fingers surprisingly steady. When she pressed the rag to his wound, he flinched more from the way her hands felt than the pain. They weren't soft. They were the hands of someone who had fought for herself alone for too long, and still fighting. "You done this before," he muttered, wincing. "My mother was a healer," she replied, voice low. "Before they married me off." The words hung between them like smoke. He didn't press. What mattered was the way she cleaned the wound, methodical, focused, and the way she didn't look away even when she saw the depth of the gash. When she finished bandaging it, she stepped back, sat across from him, and wrapped her arms around herself. The silence wasn't cold, it was exhausted. Outside, the wind clawed against the shutters. Inside, the fire flickered weakly in the stove. He added wood with one hand, gritting his teeth as the heat surged back into the room. She sat by the hearth, legs drawn up, still barefoot. Her dress, torn and blood-stained, clung to her skin. Her hair fell in thick waves across her face, but her eyes never left him. Jace pulled 2 tin mugs from the shelf and poured water. He handed her one, and for a moment their fingers brushed. He didn't flinch this time. Later that night, he lay on the cot arm, throbbing, and watched her as she settled on the floor near the fire, wrapped in his wool blanket. The light played over her face, her cheekbones, the bruise near her jaw, the fatigue written into every angle of her body. But she hadn't asked for sympathy, not once. Not even when she'd cleaned his blood with bare hands. He stared at the ceiling, his thoughts louder than the wind. Why did I take that arrow? The question kept circling back like a hawk over a dying calf. Because he didn't want her to fall. Because something about the way she ran made him remember what it meant to survive. And maybe because for the first time in a very long time, he didn't want to be alone when the fighting was over. But the fighting wasn't over. Just before dawn, Naomi jolted awake, eyes wide, chest rising fast. Jace sat up alarmed, but she raised a hand. "Just a dream," she whispered. "Not real." He didn't ask what it was. Some dreams are just memories with a pulse. She reached for the kettle and poured water into the tin cup he left out. Her fingers shook. He saw it, and he hated that he understood it too well. "You're safe now," he said, voice scratchy from sleep. Naomi looked at him with an expression that said, "No one's ever safe. Not really." And maybe she was right. If this part of the story hit you in the gut, like it did us, let us know in the comments. Type stay. If you believe in healing through connection, or run. If you still think some wounds are better left buried. And don't forget to subscribe for the next part, because what's coming down that canyon trail might change everything. The next morning, the silence between them shifted. Not awkward, just different. He handed her the coat he wore the day before, the one torn by the arrow, still stained where the blood had dried into the fabric. Naomi took it without hesitation. Didn't ask what he wanted. Just nodded and sat down near the window, pulling a needle and coarse thread from the crate near the stove. She stitched slow but firm like she'd done it before. Like this wasn't the first time she'd had to piece things back together with trembling fingers and no one to ask if it hurt. Jace watched from the other side of the room, bandaging his arm again with one hand. His breath caught when the thread pulled tight. She was mending the hole he took for her. The same hole that still burned like a reminder of what kind of world they were living in. One where a woman could be hunted like an animal and no one would raise a hand to stop it. By noon, she had cleaned the place top to bottom, wiped the dirt off the table, boiled water to scrub the floorboards, even re-braided her hair and tied the feather he gave her into the band behind her ear. The gesture wasn't lost on him. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was choosing to be seen. But Jace knew better than to believe peace ever lasted long in places like this. It came just after sundown. A sharp knock on the door. Not the kind of knock from a neighbor. It was the kind of knock that made your teeth clench. That made every bad instinct crawl up your spine. Jace opened it with his rifle in hand. A young man stood outside, early 20s, maybe blue canvas coat, cocky smile, and eyes that moved too fast. He didn't bother introducing himself, just said he was passing through looking for a stray mare. But his gaze didn't stay on Jace. It drifted inside. Toward her. Naomi didn't speak, but she stood up slowly, spine straight, and walked behind the hearth where the fire was low. Not hiding, just watching. "You sure she's safe out here?" The man asked, his voice casual but slick. "Heard there's been some raids. Apache women getting mistaken for troublemakers. Or worse." Jace didn't answer, just stepped fully between the man and the inside of the cabin. "She's with me," he said. The man smiled wider, but his hand was already resting near his belt. "I bet she is." That was enough. Jace slammed the door and bolted it. Behind him, Naomi hadn't moved. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. He watched her pick up the fire poker and set it by the door without a word. The look in her eyes was different now. Not fear, but rage held tight like a blade between teeth. "I won't run again," she said. "You won't have to." That night they didn't sleep. The fire burned high, the rifle lay loaded, and Naomi sat by the window with eyes like flint. Jace knew if those men came again, they'd be ready, and this time she wouldn't be the one bleeding. This time the fight would find them both, and they'd meet it together. The wind picked up again by morning. It hissed against the cracks in the cabin walls like a warning. Naomi was already outside stacking wood before Jace even stirred. Her movements were sharp, deliberate. No wasted energy. The girl he had pulled from the scrub brush days ago was gone. In her place now stood a woman, forged in exile, calloused, clear-eyed, and no longer waiting to be saved. But she was also carrying something Jace hadn't yet seen. Something heavy. Later that day, after they checked the corral and mended the broken trough, Naomi finally spoke. "I had a child once," she said just above the sound of the wind. "A boy." Jace stopped what he was doing, his hand frozen on the latch he'd just hammered in place. Naomi didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the hills, voice steady. "He wasn't sick. They just said I didn't deserve to raise him." Jace didn't breathe for a moment. "My uncle, he told the elders I was cursed, because I refused the marriage, because I spoke too loud, because I didn't kneel. They called it justice." She finally turned her head. "They took him in the night, said it was the will of the ancestors, but I know what it was. It was fear. Fear of a girl who said no." The fury in Jace's chest came hot and sudden like fire from a broken oil lamp. He clenched his fists against the wood beam, jaw tight, trying not to let it explode into the space between them. "They killed him?" he asked, voice a rasp. She didn't answer directly. She didn't need to. Her silence said more than any scream could. "That's why they chased me," Naomi added. "Not for stealing a horse, but because I lived. Because I ran." Jace stepped toward her slowly. "You don't have to explain, I'm not explaining." She cut in eyes, flashing. "I'm warning you." He looked into her face, so calm, so still, but beneath it, grief and fury twisted like a snake coiled tight. It wasn't just pain she carried, it was something else. Resolve. "If they ever find me," she continued, "they won't knock. They won't ask questions. They'll come with fire, like before." Jace nodded. "Then we'll meet them with fire of our own." That night, the storm arrived for real. Thunder rolled low across the canyon and lightning cracked through the dry clouds, sending nervous shudders through the gelding in the stable. Jace went out to calm the horse while Naomi stood watch inside, knife tucked into her waistband. The cabin shook once in the wind, but didn't fall. It never had, and neither had she. Hours later, when the thunder softened and only rain clattered against the tin roof, Naomi sat near the fire and watched it burn. Jace returned, soaked, shoulder-wet blood starting to leak through the bandage again. She didn't ask, just helped him remove the shirt, cleaned the wound, and rewrapped it tighter this time. Then for the first time, she reached across the small space between them and placed her hand over his heart. "You didn't flinch," she whispered. "Not even when the arrow hit." "I did," he said quietly. "Just not on the outside." Naomi looked at him, really looked, and for once her eyes softened. "I never told anyone about him," she said. "Not once." "Why now?" "Because you didn't ask." Jace didn't speak. He just leaned forward, slow and careful, and pressed his forehead to hers. No kiss, just presence, just breath and bone and firelight. Naomi didn't cry, but the silence between them cracked open enough for both of them to feel something shift. The next morning, Jace placed a second rifle by the cabin door. He said nothing when she strapped a knife to her thigh. This time, if they came, they wouldn't find a woman hiding in the shadows. They'd find a woman who'd buried her fear in the flames and a man ready to burn down anything that tried to take her again. The fire was almost out when they heard hooves. It was near midnight. Jace had been sitting at the table sharpening his knife. Naomi was coiling rope near the hearth, her movements automatic but tense. The rhythm of routine had started to feel like comfort, but that sound, the distant, deliberate clop of horses on dry earth, shattered it. Jace moved first. Quiet. Controlled. He took the rifle from behind the door and loaded it with slow precision. Naomi, without a word, reached for the pouch beneath the floorboard, the one she had kept hidden since the first night. Inside were 4 stones, each a different color and weight. She tied them into the corner of her shawl and slipped the knife into her boot. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. By the time the hooves stopped, both were outside, backs to the cabin, faces to the trail. The moon cast long, sharp shadows across the ridge, and there, about 50 feet off, sat 3 riders. Still. Watching. The lead man was the same slick-mouthed boy from days ago, except this time his grin was gone. His hand hovered near his hip like he'd practiced this moment in front of a mirror. The other 2 flanked him, older, meaner-looking. One carried a torch, the other had a rope looped at his side. "This is your last ask," the young one called. "We know she's there. She stole from her own people and ran. That makes her no better than a coyote." Naomi didn't blink. Her voice when it came was sharp as stone. "I stole nothing. I left a prison." "Doesn't matter," one of the men sneered. "You were claimed. That makes you property." That word property sent something wild roaring through Jace's chest. "You want to test that theory?" he asked. Rifle raised, eyes hard. "Come closer. See how much that rope helps you when you're bleeding out on canyon dirt." The men didn't move, but the tension in the air snapped tight like a snare string. Then from the far side of the ridge, another figure appeared, this time, not on horseback. A woman. She stepped forward slowly, alone. Hands empty but unafraid. Gray braids hung over her shoulders, and her eyes were cold as the moonlight. Naomi gasped. Jace caught the change in her immediately. "That's her," Naomi whispered. "The elder who banished me." The woman spoke in their language, sharp, formal. Naomi stiffened, then answered back, her voice raw. There was a back and forth like knives being thrown in the dark. Jace didn't understand the words, but he understood what they meant. Judgment. Rejection. Finality. Naomi stepped forward, shaking now not in fear, but rage. "You call this justice?" she shouted. "You send dogs to drag me back, and a ghost to remind me I'm nothing. I gave birth to a son under your roof. He was mine, you let him be taken." The older woman didn't reply. "I won't go back," Naomi said. "Not now, not ever." And then she did something Jace didn't expect. She pulled the 4 stones from her shawl and dropped them one by one into the dirt. Each landed with a soft thud. "I gave you everything," she said to the earth. "You gave me silence." Then she turned to Jace. "I'm not theirs anymore." He nodded once. "You never were." The 3 riders lingered a moment longer, but something had shifted. The firelight caught Naomi's face, not pleading, not afraid, and none of them dared move forward. The older woman finally turned and walked away. The others followed, one muttering curses under his breath, but not brave enough to act. By the time their hoofbeats faded into the canyon, Jace had lowered his rifle, but his hands still trembled. Naomi stood beside him, staring into the dark. "It's done?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, but it's beginning." The sun rose pale and colorless the next morning, like the sky had been scrubbed raw. The air was heavy with the scent of burned sage and wet dust, and every movement outside the cabin felt louder than it should have. Naomi stood on the porch, wrapped in her shawl, staring down at the spot where she'd dropped the 4 stones her brother's blessing turned burial. Jace stepped out with 2 tin mugs, steam curling into the morning chill. He offered her one. She took it, but didn't drink. "They'll be back," she said flatly. He nodded. "They will. Not with words next time." "No," she said, "with fire." They drank in silence, both watching the trail like it might rise up and speak. But the land didn't say anything. It never did. Not until it was too late. Later that day, Jace hitched the gelding and rode into Dustvale for supplies. He left the second rifle at home, but only because Naomi insisted on keeping it with her. He gave her a quiet look before mounting up a kind of unspoken promise, and she met it with steel in her eyes. "You come back," she said, "or I come looking." He smirked. "Deal." What neither of them expected was what would follow. Yet, it happened while Jace was gone. Quiet at first, just a bird call that didn't belong. Naomi was in the garden plot behind the cabin, kneeling in the red soil, hands dirty with fresh seed and ash. She froze, listened, then the sound again, metal creaking. She turned toward the shed and saw smoke curling from its back wall. She bolted. By the time she rounded the corner, the fire had begun to spread fast. Someone had poured lamp oil along the wood and lit it. Low, slow, deliberate. The bastards wanted it to take its time, wanted her to see it burn. Naomi didn't scream. She ran straight into the shed, pulled out the buckets, filled one from the water trough, and doused the flame line before it hit the coop. Her arms ached, throat burned, but she didn't stop until the fire hissed out in a final puff of black. Then came the crack of a boot step. She turned, fast knife already in her hand. A man stood near the edge of the fence, older, scarred. He didn't draw, just watched her like a hunter studying prey. "I told him this would happen," he said. "Told him you'd fight like a man." Naomi spat blood and ash from her mouth. "Then try me." "I ain't here to kill you," he said slowly, "just to tell you what comes next." She didn't lower the blade. He nodded toward the ridge. "You got one day. Then we bring it down. You in the cabin, and if I stay, then we burn it with you in it." Naomi's breath hitched in her throat, but she didn't flinch. She took one step forward and said, quiet and hard, "You don't scare me." "Good," he said. "That makes it fair." Then he turned and walked off, not rushed, not looking back, like he already knew the ending. When Jace returned hours later, he found her sitting in the dirt, soaked in smoke blood on her knuckles. His heart seized at the sight of her. "What happened?" he asked, jumping from the saddle. "They came," she said, "but they didn't finish the job. They'll try tomorrow." Jace crouched beside her, took her hand in his. "Then we don't wait." They didn't sleep that night. They boarded up the windows, laid out what ammunition they had, rechecked the traps along the tree line. Jace placed the revolver under Naomi's pillow without saying a word. She took it and tucked it into the waistband of her dress. Her eyes no longer held fear, only calculation. By dawn, the cabin had changed. It was no longer a shelter. It was a fortress. They came just past noon. 6 riders this time. One of them lit a torch before they even reached the ridge. Jace stood outside, rifle in hand, Naomi beside him with the pistol drawn. "You're trespassing," Jace called out. "No," the lead rider said. "You are, harboring a fugitive." Naomi stepped forward, chin lifted. "I am no one's property. You can tell your chief, your priest, your god. I belong to no one. Then die like no one." He kicked his horse forward. The first shot came from Naomi. It struck the rider clean in the shoulder, knocking him from the saddle before his torch could land. The flame hissed into the dust. Jace fired next, dropping the man beside him. Chaos exploded. Hooves pounded bullets, cracked smoke filled the canyon. Jace moved like he was back at Cold Harbor, calm, deadly, relentless. Naomi reloaded without pause, crouched behind the woodpile, every shot clean, every breath steady. 2 of the men fled after the third dropped. One stayed behind the scarred one. He dismounted, drew his knife, and came for Naomi directly. She didn't scream. She met him head-on. The fight was fast and brutal. Dust flew, blades clashed, fists struck flesh. He was stronger, but she was quicker. Smarter. She twisted, let his own weight throw him off balance, and when he hit the dirt, she didn't hesitate. She drove the knife into his shoulder, then again into his thigh. He went still. Jace rushed to her side, bleeding from a graze on his temple. "You okay?" he panted. Naomi looked down at the man, then up at him. "He said they'd burn us. Let him try," Jace growled. But no one else came. Yet, that night as the canyon turned quiet again and the fires were out, Naomi and Jace stood beside the wreckage of the shed. Neither said anything for a long time. Then Jace took her hand. "We survived," he said. Naomi nodded. "Now we build. Not just walls, not just defenses, something stronger, something that couldn't be burned." This story reminds us that survival is not enough. We must choose to live, to resist, and to build. Naomi's defiance and Jace's unwavering loyalty show that healing doesn't come from silence, but from standing together in the fire. Love built on trust, not rescue, becomes unshakable. Even when history tries to repeat itself, courage can break the cycle. The past may wound us, but it doesn't have to own us. In a world that often punishes the brave, the true victory lies in refusing to be erased and choosing to fight not just for safety but for dignity and future.